In 2025, Vietnam shipped $475 billion of goods to the world, almost the value of its entire economy. Now put $100 of those exports on this table. In the latest comparable data, about $48 of the value had already been created abroad, and foreign invested companies produced more than 3/4 of the goods leaving the country. That does not make Vietnam's rise fake. It makes the real story far more interesting. Factories are arriving, but ownership, knowledge, and profit do not move with them automatically. By the end of this episode, we will put 3 numbers on Vietnam's factory boom: how much crosses the border, how much value stays, and whether the capability can stay when cheap labor no longer does. This is the Rise Index. The factory shift is real, but the usual phrase for it is too simple. Global manufacturing is not packing up China and moving south as one giant block. China remains the deepest industrial ecosystem on Earth. What companies are doing is adding alternatives: a second assembly line, a second supplier cluster, a second country from which a finished product can reach the world. This is the strategy commonly called China Plus One. The Plus One is not a replacement for China. It is insurance against tariffs, shutdowns, political tension, rising costs, and the danger of concentrating too much production in one place. And here is the first reversal. China can lose the final assembly line and still sell many of the parts feeding it. On a map, the factory moved. In the supply chain, China may simply have moved one step upstream. Vietnam has become one of the clearest beneficiaries. In the north, industrial corridors around Bac Ninh, Thái Nguyên, and Haiphong connect electronics plants to ports and to the Chinese border. In the south, the manufacturing network around Ho Chi Minh City links factories, logistics, and one of the region's most important consumer markets. Samsung, Intel, LG, Foxconn, Amcor, and many of Apple's suppliers have built or expanded operations there. The result is not merely more factories. It is a change in what Vietnam sells to the world. In the 1980s, exports were dominated by agriculture and oil. In the 1990s and 2000s, textiles and footwear rose. By 2024, electronics, electrical products, phones, machinery, equipment, and transport products together accounted for almost half of Vietnamese exports. This is industrial transformation at national scale. But transformation is not the same as completion. The central question is no longer whether Vietnam can attract factories it can. The question is what those factories build around them. Watch these 3 boxes. Vietnam has clearly won the first. The rest of the episode is about whether it can fill the other 2. The scale makes that question impossible to postpone. In 2025, Vietnam's total goods trade reached about $930 billion, roughly 1.8 times the size of GDP. Few large economies are this exposed to what crosses their borders. When global demand rises, factories transmit the gain quickly. When tariffs, shipping, or foreign orders turn, the same transmission works growth engine and one of its largest vulnerabilities. Vietnam's growth engine and one of its largest vulnerabilities. The rise did not begin with the latest trade dispute. The foundation was laid in 1986, when the Doi Moi reforms began moving Vietnam away from a closed, centrally planned agrarian system and toward a more market-oriented economy connected to global trade. Vietnam joined the World Trade Organization in 2007. Later came a dense network of trade agreements: the CPTPP across the Pacific, the EVFTA with the European Union, and RCEP across much of Asia. Those agreements do not all open the same markets, and they do not eliminate every tariff immediately. What they do is make Vietnam unusually connected. A company producing there can combine Asian inputs with preferential access across multiple large markets, provided it meets the relevant rules of origin. That final condition matters. A label saying, "Made in Vietnam" is not always enough. To receive preferential treatment, a product may need a defined share of qualifying local or regional content. Trade access therefore rewards not only final assembly, but the supplier network behind it. This creates a useful test. If a product leaves a Vietnamese port, but repeatedly fails the origin rules of its destination market, The label moved farther than the supply chain did. The next foundation was labor. In 2025, Vietnam had a population of about 102 million and a labor force of roughly 53.5 million. For years, manufacturers could combine a large workforce with labor costs below China and an improving record in industrial execution. Cost helped open the door, but cost alone cannot explain the result. Countries with lower wages than Vietnam have attracted less advanced manufacturing. A multinational also needs roads, ports, electricity, managers, custom systems, predictable policy, and suppliers capable of meeting demanding schedules. Vietnam's geographic position strengthens the package. It shares a border with China, where an enormous share of the world's components, tooling, and industrial materials are still produced. It also has a long coastline facing major shipping routes. This creates an unusual advantage. A company can diversify final production away from China without moving every supplier at once. Components can still arrive from the established Chinese ecosystem, be processed or assembled in Vietnam, then leave through Vietnamese ports. The trade numbers show both sides of that bridge. In 2025, China was Vietnam's largest source of goods imports at $186 billion. The United States was Vietnam's largest export market at $153 billion. Those economy-wide figures do not describe a single factory, but they reveal the structure. Inputs arriving from one direction, finished goods leaving heavily in another. Then came the accelerants. The United States-China trade conflict, increased tariff risk after 2018. Pandemic shutdowns exposed the cost of relying on one production base. Companies that had already considered diversification now had reasons to act faster. Vietnam did not suddenly become attractive. The world finally became more sensitive to the advantages Vietnam had spent decades assembling. But none of this tells us whether Vietnam is becoming richer because of the factory or merely busier around it. For that, the $475 billion headline has to be taken apart. And once a cluster begins, it can reinforce itself. An anchor manufacturer attracts logistics providers, industrial park developers, maintenance contractors, and specialized labor. A supplier then has a reason to locate nearby because several potential customers are within reach. Local officials learn what permits and infrastructure the industry requires. The 10th factory is easier to place than Suntrit Seoul in 2025. Because the first 9 have already reduced uncertainty. This helps explain why the same northern provinces attract repeated rounds of electronics investment. Companies are not choosing only a wage rate. They are choosing a network whose previous investments make the next investment less risky. The obvious answer to the title is therefore straightforward. Factories are adding capacity in Vietnam because it offers competitive labor, proximity to China's supply base, access to multiple trade blocks, a large workforce, and an established record of hosting export manufacturing. The investment data supports that story, if the numbers are read correctly. Foreign investment is usually reported in 2 ways: registered capital measures commitments approved or added on paper, disbursed capital measures money actually put to work. In 2025, Vietnam attracted about $38.4 billion in registered foreign investment. The disbursed figure was lower at $27.6 billion, but it was still a record. Confusing the two can make a factory boom look larger or smaller than it is. A registration is a signal of intent. Disbursement is closer to cranes, equipment, payroll, and production. In other words, $38.4 billion was promised. $27.6 billion crossed into the real economy. The second number is the one a worker can stand inside. So, there is also a timing advantage. Building a complete industrial ecosystem from nothing can take decades. Vietnam does not need to reproduce all of China before receiving the first investment. It can specialize in selected stages while importing the rest. That model has already produced genuine gains. Per capita income increased almost 6-fold between 1990 and 2023. Export manufacturing created employment infrastructure, management experience, and access to markets that domestic companies could not have built as quickly on their own. The presence of foreign ownership does not make those benefits imaginary. Workers are paid in Vietnam. Local services support the plants. Taxes, land, logistics, and training affect the domestic economy. Skills can move when employees change firms or start businesses. This is why dismissing Vietnam as only assembly misses what assembly can do. Every industrial economy has to begin somewhere, and reliable large-scale production is itself a capability. But gross export numbers can make that capability look more domestic than it is. To see the limit, we need the second ledger. There is another reason to avoid dismissing the first stage. A factory imposes discipline that is difficult to learn from a textbook. Defect rates measured in parts per million, documentation that follows every component, and production changes that must work across thousands of units. Those routines can raise productivity beyond the factory if workers and suppliers carry them into the wider economy. The uncertainty is not whether learning occurs. It is how widely the learning spreads. Now return to the $100 on the table. The customs ledger counts $100 crossing the border. It does not say where those $100 were created. An electronics product may contain a processor fabricated elsewhere, memory from another country, a display from another, precision equipment imported for the factory, and software or intellectual property owned by the global brand. Vietnam contributes wages, factory operations, utilities, logistics, local materials, services, taxes, and some supplier output. All of that matters, but the imported content must be separated from the gross selling value. Using comparable 2020 value chain data, the OECD estimates that foreign value added accounts for about 48% of Vietnam's gross exports. Put differently, roughly 52% is domestic value added. That is far more than the tiny single-digit share sometimes claimed in simplified smartphone breakdowns. But it is also far less than the headline export number suggests. And domestic value added is not the same as Vietnamese ownership. Value created inside a foreign-owned factory can count as domestic value added even when some profit ultimately belongs to a parent company abroad. This gives us three ledgers, not one. Ledger 1, gross exports, the border value. Ledger 2, domestic value added, what is generated inside Vietnam. Ledger 3, domestic ownership and capability, which firms own the technology, supplier relationships, brands, and decisions. The first ledger is spectacular. The second is substantial but smaller. The third remains the hardest to measure and the hardest to build. Turn the OECD ratio into a simple economy-wide visual. For every $100 of gross exports, around $48 represents value previously created abroad. Roughly $52 is generated inside Vietnam. But that 52 includes different things: labor income, domestic services, taxes, depreciation, and profits earned by both Vietnamese and foreign invested firms. So the correct question is not, does all the money leave? It does not. Nor is it, was the entire export made in Vietnam? It was not. The useful question is how the domestic 52 changes over time. Does more of it come from Vietnamese suppliers, skilled work, engineering, and intellectual property, or does the composition remain concentrated in factory operations? The ownership pattern is visible in the export data. In 2025, foreign invested companies produced 77.3% of Vietnam's goods exports. Domestic firms produced less than a quarter. The World Bank identifies an even more revealing trend. The share of domestic businesses participating in global value chains fell from 35% in 2009 to 18% in 2023. That does not mean Vietnamese firms disappeared. It means the export machine expanded faster than domestic companies connected to it. This is the paradox at the center of Vietnam's rise. The country is more deeply integrated into global manufacturing, while many local firms remain weakly integrated into the foreign-led factories operating inside the country. The factory arrived. The supplier ladder did not always arrive with it. There is one industry where every rung of that ladder has a name: design, fabrication, packaging, and test. Semiconductors let us see exactly how high Vietnam has climbed. Building that ladder requires more than asking multinationals to buy local. A global electronics company cannot substitute a domestic part merely because it is cheaper or politically desirable. The part must meet specifications repeatedly, survive audits, scale quickly, and remain traceable through the product's life. A small Vietnamese supplier may need new machinery and certification before receiving an order, but may struggle to finance either without the order. That circular problem, no contract without capability, no capability without a contract, is where supplier development policy and patient finance become decisive. Semiconductors provide the clearest test of whether that ladder is beginning to form. In the previous episode, we separated chip design, fabrication, equipment, materials, packaging, and testing. They are all part of one industry, but they do not carry the same cost, knowledge, or strategic control. Vietnam already has a meaningful position in the back end. Intel says its Ho Chi Minh City site is the company's largest assembly and test facility. It packages and tests processors after the silicon has been fabricated elsewhere. In Bac Ninh, Amkor opened an advanced packaging and test campus in 2023. The company has committed $1.6 billion to its first 2 phases and describes the site as poised to become its most extensive and most advanced facility. Packaging should not be dismissed as simply putting a chip in a box. Advanced packaging connects dies, memory, and other components into systems. As physical scaling becomes harder and AI systems demand more bandwidth, packaging can carry more engineering value than the word assembly implies. Vietnam also has more design activity than the usual low-value narrative suggests. The OECD counted around 26,000 semiconductor engineers, approximately 50 chip design companies, and 7 assembly, packaging, and testing facilities in the data available for its 2025 survey. That is an ecosystem, not an empty map, but it is still incomplete. At the time covered by the OECD survey, Vietnam had no operating semiconductor foundry. It could design selected chips and export packaged semiconductors, but it still depended on wafers fabricated abroad. Then in January 2026, the story changed. Vietnam broke ground on its first domestic chip fabrication plant at Hoa Lac High-Tech Park. The project, led by Viettel, is intended to complete construction, receive technology transfer, and begin trial production by the end of 2027. That is not the same as an operating fab. A groundbreaking does not prove yield, reliability, cost competitiveness, or scale. The process technology and commercial economics will determine what the plant can actually do. 4 words matter: announced, built, qualified, competitive. Vietnam has crossed the first line and begun the second. The last 2 will decide whether this becomes capability or ceremony. But it is also not merely a slogan. Concrete, equipment, training, and process transfer are a different category of commitment from a long-term aspiration. Vietnam has set a target of training 50,000 semiconductor engineers and graduates by 2030. Its national strategy calls for at least 1 small-scale fabrication plant, 100 design companies, and 10 packaging and test plants in the first phase. The chip test, therefore, gives us a more precise verdict than Vietnam only assembles. Vietnam is strongest in assembly, test, and increasingly advanced packaging. It has a real but smaller design base. It has begun building its first domestic fabrication capability. The latter exists. The distance between the rungs remains large, and the rungs should not be ranked too crudely. A leading-edge logic fab is more capital-intensive and strategically concentrated than conventional packaging, but advanced packaging is becoming part of chip performance itself. Connecting multiple dies with high-speed memory can determine whether an AI accelerator works as a system. Moving from commodity assembly into advanced packaging can therefore increase value and technical learning without immediately competing with the most advanced foundries in Taiwan, South Korea, or the United States. The realistic path may not be a single leap from factory floor to technocock, It may be a sequence of narrower specializations that deepen until foreign customers would find the Vietnamese ecosystem difficult to replace. Winning factories does not remove constraints. It changes which constraints matter. The first is the domestic supplier gap. When foreign manufacturers import components, equipment, and specialized services, Vietnam gains production and employment, but fewer spillovers reach local firms. The next stage requires Vietnamese suppliers able to meet global standards for precision, volume, traceability, and delivery. That is harder than offering cheap labor. A supplier may need expensive certification, long periods without guaranteed orders, specialized finance and engineers who understand both the product and the multinational customer's process. The second constraint is skills. Vietnam's workforce is large, but the economy now needs more technicians, process engineers, software specialists, researchers, and managers. The OECD argues that tertiary education and innovation capacity must improve if domestic firms are to absorb foreign technology rather than simply work beside it. The third constraint is infrastructure, especially electricity, logistics, and compliance systems. An assembly plant can lose competitiveness through a port delay. A semiconductor line can lose far more through unstable power or contaminated processes. As the work becomes more advanced, reliability matters more than the wage difference that attracted the first factory. The fourth constraint is demographics. Vietnam still has a large working-age population, but the demographic tailwind is weakening. To reach high-income status by 2045, the OECD estimates labor productivity would need to grow by roughly 6.3% a year as the working age share declines. That turns upgrading from an ambition into a deadline. The country cannot rely indefinitely on adding more workers to more assembly lines. The fifth constraint is the changing trade environment. Vietnam benefits when companies diversify around tariffs on China, but assembly-heavy production is also exposed when importing countries tighten rules of origin, traceability requirements, or tariffs on Vietnam itself. The United States bought nearly 1/3 of Vietnam's gross exports in recent data. That concentration creates demand, but it also gives changes in American trade policy unusual power over Vietnamese factories. China plus one can bring a factory in. It cannot guarantee the factory stays. Here is the uncomfortable test. If another country offers lower wages tomorrow, what would be too difficult to move? A building is movable capital. A dense network of trusted suppliers and engineers is not. The strongest defense is not permanently lower wages. It is a local ecosystem expensive to replace. Suppliers, engineers, logistics, trusted standards, design teams, and domestic customers. Energy and carbon now belong on that list. Export manufacturing has made Vietnam's growth more carbon intensive, while global buyers are demanding cleaner power and better emissions data from suppliers. A factory deciding where to build may increasingly ask not only whether electricity is cheap, but whether it is reliable and whether the product can meet the carbon rules of its destination market. Grid investment and cleaner generation are therefore industrial policy, not separate environmental decoration. So why are global factories moving to Vietnam? Because decades of trade integration, industrial learning, and infrastructure put Vietnam in position before the shock arrived. Competitive labor made it attractive. Proximity to China made diversification practical. Trade agreements widened market access. Geopolitical and pandemic risk made the second production base urgent. But moving needs the right scale. Much of the shift is additional capacity, selected products, and new investment, not the disappearance of China from the supply chain. In many cases, China remains upstream while Vietnam expands downstream. The network is being stretched across another border, not rebuilt from zero. Has Vietnam captured real value from this? Yes. Domestic value added is roughly half of gross exports, not a trivial residue. Manufacturing has created jobs, incomes, infrastructure, exports knowledge, and a platform for more advanced cavity design base, Intel's operations, Amcor, advanced packaging, and the new beyond simple final assembly. Moving beyond simple final assembly Has Vietnam captured control of the system? Not yet. Foreign invested firms still produce more than 3/4 of goods exports. Imported content remains high. Domestic participation in global supply chains has weakened relative to the scale of the export boom. Most leading brands, core platforms, and high-value technologies remain externally owned. The outcome can be judged by 3 conversions. First, can foreign factories create domestic suppliers? The key number is not only how much the factory exports, but how much it buys competitively from Vietnamese firms. Second, can production employment create portable skill? The test is whether technicians and engineers can move into design, process development, management, and local entrepreneurship. Third, can investment create innovation? The test is not the number of registered projects, but whether research, intellectual property, and high-value decisions begin to happen inside the country. If those conversions accelerate, the foreign-led factory is a school, a customer, and a launch platform. If they do not, the same factory can become a ceiling, productive, valuable, but always vulnerable to the next lower-cost location or trade rule. The current scoreboard is mixed. On suppliers, domestic participation in global value chains has fallen relative to the export boom. A warning. On skills, the semiconductor workforce and training targets are expanding, an opening, but not yet proof of quality at scale. On innovation, advanced packaging, design firms, and construction of the first fab point upward, while foreign ownership of exports and imported content. How far the system still depends on outside capital and technology. This is why the next decade matters more than another record export year. Record volume proves that Vietnam can operate the platform. The composition of that volume will reveal whether the platform is becoming Vietnamese capability. So end where we began, with 3 numbers. $475 billion crossed the totes. Roughly 52 of every 100 export dollars was created inside Vietnam in the latest comparable data. But more than 3/4 of goods exports still came from foreign invested firms. Together, those numbers say something no single headline can. The climb is real, and control is incomplete. Vietnam is moving from gearbox toward electronics, from assembly toward advanced packaging, from packaging toward selected design, and a first attempt at fabrication. The next victory is not another factory announcement. It is the moment a global factory cannot operate without Vietnamese suppliers, Vietnamese engineers, and Vietnamese decisions. Factories open the door. Domestic capability will decide whether Vietnam walks through it or whether the door moves again. But the map contains another side to this movement. For decades, rich countries accepted the other side of this bargain: cheaper goods, higher margins, and fewer factories at home. Then they discovered that a supply chain can be dismantled much faster than it can be rebuilt. Next time we follow the map in reverse: why rich countries stopped making things, and what happened when they tried to bring the factories back. This is the Rise Index. Subscribe and follow where power moves next.